Again, I'm Julie Schablitsky, and a lot of people. Oh, and so I guess the thing about MDOT, a lot of people don't know that they have archaeologists. Like, what's this highway agency and this MVA and the port? Why would they, of course, have archaeologists? And the reason we do is because there are federal laws, like the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. There's NEPA. There's 4F, which is the Transportation Act. All these federal and state laws require us to consider our impacts to cemeteries and archaeological sites, historic buildings, you name it. I mean, we have to get out there before the bulldozer comes to make sure that they can either try and design around these important resources or minimize their impact. So that's why we're there. We're there to kind of help them design. So we're there way in advance of any of the design or before the project at all. So usually you don't see archaeologists next to backhoes. You usually see us in the office, like designing and trying to minimize impacts. So how many people were here last time listening to the Harriet Tubman stuff? Okay, so not a lot. All right, so we've got some like a little bit of extra review to do for everybody else. But in addition to being an archaeologist, I also oversee the Secretary's office, the Maryland Department of Transportation's Office of Cultural Resources. Now, that's kind of the mothership. And then you have things like the MDA, the Port, the Aviation Administration, Transportation Administration, Transportation Authority, the Port, of course, which is busy with the Key Bridge issue. So all these sorts of places have cultural resources needs. And so there are many other archaeologists out there. And so I deal with compliance like that for those projects, but we also oversee the historical marker program. So you're probably all familiar with those black and white markers along the highways. And the interesting thing there is that program's been around since the 1930s. And it's involved the State Roads Commission, which is the precursor to State Highway. And they also usually would partner with the Maryland Historical Society, and now it's the Maryland Historical Trust, who's now our partner in this. So about 2 years, MDOT took over all of that, and we keep MHT, the Maryland Historical Trust, in as kind of a review agency. We've been busy because there's a backlog of markers. So if any of you have applied for one of these markers, it may or may not have happened in a couple of years. But we're trying to get that backlog dealt with and start rolling. So at the end, I'll give you some links to visit. So in addition to that, I also am really active in public archaeology and stewardship, looking at historical sites along transportation routes. And initially, the Federal Highway Administration gave us money for that. And then they're like, we're done with that. I'm like, okay. So then I had to look for money somewhere else. So the good news is that we're in an administration now that supports archaeology, and specifically the African diaspora and those historic sites on slavery, enslavement, and empowerment of Black communities. So of course, there is a lot of money now for me to do some really good work with our teams out there along the entire state. But right now, we're focused in the swamps of Dorchester County, looking at the lives of Harriet Tubman and the rest of her community. So today, we're gonna be all over the place because we're at the beginning of a lot of new projects. We're in the middle of projects, and we're starting new ones. So we're going to be going all over. It's mostly going to be in swampy terrain, but a little bit in Africa. And we're going to learn a little bit about religion. So before we start going, I'm going to go ahead and get you guys oriented since we're feeling all, let's see if I can, hang on my glasses. All right. Okay, the poker, okay, the beeper. Okay, so here we are. Where are we? We're here. Oh, there's Ellicott City. So how many people have been to the Eastern Shore? Okay, if you haven't, you're going to want to go after this. So the way you get there is you travel over to 50. Everybody knows where Annapolis is. You cross the Bay Bridge, cross Kent Island, and you pretend you're going to go to Ocean City, but you're not. So you go 50 down to Easton. You go through Trapp. You cross the Choptank River here. You're already feeling much calmer. And then you get to Cambridge, and this is basically Tubman country. There's murals, there's museums, there's this really great app that you can download about the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway, which is a lot of what our projects, focus on. But then once you get to here and you look at this area down here, this is the land that time forgot. There's these weird things called sitka deer that are out there. They're these like elk deer things that have been brought there in the early 20th century, and people they hang out in the swamp. I mean, you can only see them here, other kind of really random places. there's ducks, anyway, it's very, very interesting. So once we get down to Cambridge, I got you to go to Cambridge, we're gonna we're gonna zoom in even more. And we're gonna look at archaeology sites. So here's Cambridge, and you're gonna get to Harriet Tubman's birthplace by going on 16, going all the way down to Church Creek. You're gonna go to Wolford, and then there's this Harrisville Road that goes all the way down there. And unless you have four-wheel drive and some clearance, you're not gonna be able to make it. Climate change has really caused sea level rise to really take away these sites, and that's one of the reasons we're down there. We went there because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recently acquired some private property, and they knew from historical documents that Ben Ross's home was somewhere there. Ben Ross is the father of Harriet Tubman. Ben Ross, as enslaver, owned all this property, about 1,000 acres. His name was Anthony Thompson, and he lived right about there. And over the last few years, we've found two very important sites. Of course, Ben Ross's site. We call it Ben's 10 because in the will, Anthony Thompson in 1836 gave him 10 acres to use as he needed and to go ahead and live in his cabin through his life. In the survey that we did, we also ran across what we call the quarter site. That is a really robust building. It was 20 foot by 30 foot, had a brick foundation, wonderful artifacts. It was buried underneath this farm field, and we ended up finding it, and we're learning through oral history that might even be the place where Harriet Tubman was born. So very, very interesting. So right here, this is where we're going to go first, and then I'm going to take you to another area along Madison. So keep this in mind. So you're here in Harrisville, but there's also Madison, and there's this another road that kind of parallels Harrisville Road. And this here was the truly Harriet Tubman's area. This was her neighborhood. This was where her family and friends lived. And so her story is important, but you can learn a lot about someone when you meet their friends and relatives, right? So that's kind of part of the rest of the story that I'm going to be getting to. So let's start with Ben Ross's home place. So we found this a few years ago. It is down along the landing site. We barely found it. We were digging. We finally came up and found literally just a handful of artifacts, and the ones that you see up here on the right, the tobacco pipe stems, this button, and a gun flint, which was repurposed into a striker light for fires. That wasn't even what we found. We found these little crumbles of white ceramic, and we're like, well, this looks kind of interesting, and we're looking for a early 1800s site. This could be it, and it was. We ended up digging and digging, and sure enough, we found something. We found important stains in the soil, but this area has been impacted. It was logged on for multiple years. Ben Ross was a lumberman himself. In fact, he was a foreman that oversaw all the enslaved people that worked in that industry under Anthony Thompson. So he was kind of in charge. His home was down there. A lot of people wonder, well, did Harriet Tubman live there? Well, Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross in around 1822, and she did live there for some of the time as a teenager. Now, to kind of explain the complication and also the trauma that these people had went through, you have Anthony Thompson enslaved Ben Ross. Anthony Thompson became a widow, and there was a woman named Mary Brodess. Mary Brodess was also widowed, and she married Anthony Thompson. They brought their enslaved people together. At that point, Ben Ross, who was enslaved by Anthony Thompson, met Rick Green, who was enslaved by Mary Brodess, and they began their family. And from that union, that's where Araminta Ross, Harriet Tubman, came from. Now, the problem, though, is that Harriet Tubman and Rick Green belonged to the Brodess family. So when Mary Brodess passed, they didn't then end up with Anthony Thompson, the enslaver Ben Ross. They ended up going with the heir, which was the son of Mary Brodess. So then they went back to Bucktown. So Harriet Tubman was only here for about 3 years as a small child before she went to Bucktown. So that's why sometimes when you go down there, you see some confusion about where she was born. She was born here, but then she would live, and then she also rented herself out. So that's how she kind of also ended up back here as a teenage girl. All right, so that's a lot, and if you have questions later, we can unpack that yet again. So what did we find there at Ben Ross's place? Well, we talked about little crumbles of artifacts, but we also were trying to look for things in the soil. And the first thing you might notice, at least you do as an archaeologist, is that you have these bricks here and you have some bricks here. But you also notice how it's just barely underneath the surface. This is a site that was laid down probably around 1800. So we're looking at over 200 years of soil, and that's as deep as it got. Part of that's because of logging, the erosion, just the compaction of the soil. That causes a lot of the shallowness of the soil. But you can also see it's only one layer of brick. It's not a large foundation. So we think that this home that Ben Ross lived in was probably on brick piers of some time, or it might have even been in a post and ground structure that would have been raised up. But it didn't last long. It was probably gone by about 1850 based on the artifacts. But that's what we're finding. I could never, and this is a frustrating thing, from that, I don't know where the corners are. I don't know how big the building was. It couldn't have been over the 20 by 30 feet. That would have been pretty large for that time. So maybe 15 by 25. I might just be guessing, but it wouldn't have been a large structure. But he would have had himself, his kids at some point in there, and maybe even Rit at some point. But again, very small structure. He also may have been there temporarily, where he would have gone out to the different parts of the timber stands to be harvesting and be with the crew. So he may have just had this as his home base, and he came back to it more infrequently. So what did it look like? We can kind of guess. Let's see. Before we go, this too, you can't see it very well, but here, let me show you here. See that and that? We're digging out stains in the soil, and they're like basically little troughs that we're digging, and they look like could they be plow scars? Because sometimes in fields we see that. But when we dug inside of the types of artifacts we found were little nail fasteners. And so, okay, so wood, maybe they're wood planks or some sort of logs of some type that had fasteners and nails in them. So I'm thinking that's what they are. But was it a wall that collapsed out, and that's what we're seeing is a stain in the soil? Or was it just a pile of lumber that was set there and just like kind of disintegrated there for us to find 150, 200 years later? I don't know. So what did the building look like? This is just shows you how rustic it is. We don't know, but it would have looked something like this probably. You see that right here, there's not much of a stairways. So maybe the brick that we found would have been a ramp that would have led up to the inside of this building. But it's just, again, you can tell it's poverty, and they didn't have a lot. And there would have been a front door, there would have been windows, but again, they didn't have money to keep up their house. I mean, it's really hard just to keep up your house nowadays, and expensive. Back then when you have nothing and you're basically at the whim of your enslaver, and you did have the opportunity to go out and to make money, but again, it was just enough for little extras, nothing that would really be substantial. This is probably going to be, I would say, maybe 1880s or so, just based on, but I don't have the exact date for it. Maybe late 19th century. So what else were we finding there in that swampy area? Right here, again, the lighting in here isn't the best for the images, but you can see there's kind of a hole dug out here. And then you can see the water already coming up. And this was a dry day. So sea level rise, it's not just like erosion from the shoreline, it's actually percolating up through the soil. So it's the water table that's rising that's really giving us the problem. But in here we found these weird kind of pits here and there, and I'm wondering if it was from a post and ground structure. So we may have had a post in there, it was raised up, and then the post was pulled or disintegrated, and that's what we're left with. Inside we did have some artifacts, not tons. It wasn't a place with a lot of artifacts, but we found some personal artifacts. One of them included this pipe bowl. So these are kaolin clay tobacco pipes, very, very popular through the 19th century into the early 20th century. It's really funny if you look at just the evolution of these pipe bowls. They're really, in the 17th century, the pipe bowls are super small, and I'm like, why? What was the deal? Did they just not enjoy their tobacco as much? Well, that's not the case. Tobacco was super expensive back then. So you're only taking a little bit at a time, but then by the time you're in the 19th century, you've got these big old bowls happening. And then in the 20th century, grandpa's pipe, I mean, that really gets big. So that's kind of interesting to kind of, learn about pipes. But it's the thing I want you to kind of take note is, again, this is a contested landscape. You're with enslaved people. You're enslaved. It's here. You have a pipe bowl with the eagle. The eagle. You can see the shield here and the wings, and there's like a laurel leaf here maybe, and some stars. So this is patriotic, but it's also emits a feeling of freedom. And that's the one thing we need to really think about, is that these people who were enslaved, they had agency, they had choice. They weren't just kind of in their area that they go work and they come back and they go ahead and smoke their pipe. They weren't just given everything by their enslaver. They had the ability to go out and get their own things. They were gifted items, and so they had choice. So if you think about that, and if you were enslaved and you went to a place to go buy yourself a pipe, what would you choose? Would you choose something with just a cockle type design around the outside? Would you choose something with a horse or a bird, or would you choose this patriotic symbol? And what does that mean, right? So again, just things to think about. Again, we're all in the middle of where we're finding artifacts, looking at artifacts in the lab, and we're kind of trying to understand and put the pieces together about what did this mean to them? Not what does it mean to me as a white woman digging up Black history. What did it mean to them as being enslaved during the 19th century? So another artifact that kind of had a lot of meaning to a lot of people and was very powerful and poignant to this entire site and this discovery was this 1808 coin. This was one of the first artifacts that I found it. Usually I'm like, dig there. What are you finding here? But this chance I actually got to find something pretty cool. So when we're digging along the Harrisville Road going down to the landing, looking for this site, we're digging holes, looking for things, finding nothing. And that's when I grabbed the metal detector and I said, I'm going to try and find something. So I jumped out along the area that was a lot of hunting. It's probably, if anybody's ever metal detected, you know that the shotgun shells are really disappointing when you dig them up because you're hoping for a coin or a button. But in this case, we pulled up this coin, found it within the first 5 minutes, and I kept on looking for another couple hours and found nothing else. So this to me was my sign that you're getting close. And when I got this back and I started looking at it and looked at the symbolism, you have Lady Liberty. You have, again, that bald eagle, freedom and strength and all those symbols. But then the year 1808 is the year they outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in the United States. It's also the date, 1808 is the date that Rit Green and Ben Ross married and began the family. So this, again, is a very important date, and I'm not super superstitious, but I think I'm going to take this one as kind of a symbol to keep going, because within a couple of days, we did end up finding the site at the end. So again, symbolism of artifacts and what did it mean? Was this in Ben's pocket? Did he keep that because it was given to him on his wedding day? I mean, was it in Rit's pocket? We don't know. These are just stories, but it's interesting nonetheless. So what else did we find there? This looks really uninteresting, and sometimes they're like nails, and we lovingly refer to them as Cheetos because they are these like kind of little rusty, like little Cheeto like objects that come out of the ground. And but we've got this great little kind of loophole that we're able to see what it is, because if you actually would break it apart, it would just crumble. And if not, these items aren't conserved, which this one probably won't be, because really there's nothing left inside of it that you could conserve. There's no iron. There's just a shadow of what's inside. But if you x-ray that, you can find out all sorts of things. So in this little glob, there's this interesting mechanism. And when we did some research, we learned that it's part of a lever tumbler for, I think it's called a Barton's box lock. So this would have been a door. So you can see this would have gone into like the where the strike plate was, and you'd have like, there would have been a key, and you'd have locked the door. So there's an article that just came out in the Journal for Historical Archaeology on the meaning of all these padlocks and locks and these that are being found on places of enslavement, on slave sites. And they're like, what does this mean? Because this, again, creates some sort of agency. And the academic take on this is that what you're seeing here is you're seeing that there's some negotiation between the enslaver and the slaves, that you're having a conversation that, hey, I have this building, I want it to be secured, so when I leave in the day, I can lock it up so I don't have people inside of my stuff. And it, in a way, it would give them some sort of like sense of security, some sense of peace in a place where nothing is theirs. So it's interesting. I did another slave site down at Belvoir, which is in Anne Arundel County, and there's all sorts of things. There's padlocks, there's little like locks on chests, all sorts of, there's locks on interior doors, exterior doors. So it's common, but it's also it's saying something to us. So Ben Ross was allowed to have some sort of independence in a way and some sort of security. So when he left in the morning to go out with his crew, he locked his door and came back and felt confident that nobody would have rifled through his things and taken what was his. So that's Ben Ross. So I just want to know, is there any questions real quick on Ben Ross before we go to the next site? That is, so archaeologists have this interesting, well, they have this experience that they look for this. And so it looked, when you've looked at enough little things, you start to like be able to do research. So it's not like you're going to look at this and say, oh, that must be like a lock to this Baron's lock. And you're not, so when you see this thing and you're like, well, it could be part of a gun or it could be part of a lock. Oh, this thing. Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. No, that's okay. So that, it's rusty. So we can tell when we get these little blobs, they're like crunchy and they kind of have these little bits that fall off. That's irony. So if anybody's, we've all experienced iron rusting in our lives, in our cars and like our tools. So it looks like that, but it almost looks like there's dirt encased around it. So, and there's also the weight of it. You can tell it's just not a dirt clod, the weight, the iron's a little heavier. So just holding it in your hand and being able to weigh it and just looking at just the shape of it and just the context it's coming in, right? So that told us that's something. And so when you put them underneath an X-ray them, sometimes you'll see like a scissor handle, you'll see a nail, you'll see sometimes, I think we even got an inside part of a like an iron for like ironing clothing. So it's an interesting thing, but that's a thing. And we've seen enough that just the shape and then sometimes the weight and just it crumbling enough. And I will like confess, sometimes we kind of break pieces off a little bit to see what's going on. So, because sometimes we get 2 artifacts instead of 1. So, yeah, but that's how we figured that one out. Any other questions about Ben Ross's before we go to Thompson Quarter? Yeah. If we have an X-ray that we can take in the field, no, it's one of those things where, like, you know, in the doctor's office you have to wear those capes on you. It's basically the same thing. So these things, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take them down to the Maryland Archaeology Conservation Lab in Calvert County. If you've ever been to Patterson Park, they've got a big lab there, and they've got a huge room. And they basically lay things on a tray, and they can go ahead and back off, and they push the button, and then the image, of course, is created, and then we can read it. So instead of reading broken bones, we're reading, you know, broken artifacts here. So, but that's how we do it. It's definitely like a lab thing, and that's the thing too. Is like when we're in the field, like we'll be in the field 2 weeks, but we'll be out of the field, you know, 6 months in the office and the lab doing all these sorts of this archaeological work. Yes.
And how did you know it was Ben Ross?
So how do we know that was Ben Ross's place? So there were historical documents that talked about Ben being enslaved by Anthony Thompson. We knew what Anthony Thompson's property was. There were also a will that told that they were going to give Ben a place to live with 10 acres. And also that there was a land deed that talked about old Ben's place being below Parker's field. And Parker was a farm that was given to, he bought it from Anthony Thompson. So Parker's fields were the old Thompson property. So we knew they were below the field, and it said that would be binding to a road. So there's only one historical road cutting through there, Harrisville Road. And just by having that, we had a search area. That's why we took us 1,000 holes. It wasn't an easy task. But looking for the presence and absence of those artifacts, we were able to narrow it down. And only one location of those broken artifacts came up. And that was the site from the first half of the 1800s. So that was the only candidate that we had out there that could be his site. So it's kind of like the process of elimination, and there was only, you know, one possible site. So that was it. Any other questions before we jump off of Ben Ross's and go to the other site? Okay. So the Thompson Court, if you'll remember, you had the Anthony Thompson site, his manor house. About a mile away was Ben Ross's, where we just were. And if you go to the north, about a half mile away, we have the Thompson Quarter, and that was found in an interesting way as well. So again, apologies for the kind of bleached out photos, but this is a farm field. And on a rainy day, Aaron, my partner in crime, we went walking along the field because he saw more maps that talked about there being some sort of old site that used to be there in this location. And so we walked the field and we found one little piece of brick. And that little piece of brick told us that there could be something more there. So we returned and did some shovel test pits and ended up finding, am I buzzing?
A little bit, let's just switch mics.
Okay. Okay, is that better? Okay. Okay, so Thompson Quarter. So we looked around, we ended up finding that there had to be a site here. We dug around, we found artifacts, we found a brick, part of a brick foundation. I'm like, this is crazy. Let's go ahead and pull out ground penetrating radar. I know you all familiar with GPR. So cemeteries love ground penetrating radar because if you pull this like little radar along the ground, it looks like you're mowing lawn. But when you pull it along the ground, it's sending radar waves down to the ground, and it'll bounce back up, and your machine will catch it and tell you whether you have a weird kind of like, grave shaft, or it'll tell you if you have a cellar. It'll tell you if you have a foundation. So that's the beauty of ground penetrating radar, is that it will allow you to find these kind of interesting things. So we did that. We wondered what we could find out there. And you'll see that it popped just out. So you have this nice map here. All these other noise over here is like burned areas, because we did ground penetrating radar and magnetometry. So we superimposed both those layers on top of each other. That gave us magnetic signatures. So anything iron or copper would have come back and had a signature, as well as any sort of different depths and textures within the soil. So that's why we got this nice rectangular shape here. And here it's sort of there's maybe a cellar, and then maybe something else going on here, but we had to dig to learn more, right? But it was great. I mean, this is great. It tells you it's 20 foot by 30 foot. It was made out of brick, and it was really well built, and it was really perplexing because I'm like, is this a quarter where enslaved people lived, or is it something more? Because I'm looking at Ben Ross's, which was not hardly anything in the ground. Then you have this thing. So this is a bird's eye view of this. And so I'm going to take you through this because it's probably kind of a little confusing. But here's the rectangle that we were just looking at. So this is a 20 foot by 30 foot home. You've got this orange smear here. This is going to be your fireplace. So there has a large fireplace place there. A lot of times when you find these in slave quarters, the situation there is that it was a large kitchen. So this was a person probably cooking a lot of meals and foods for people in this space. This is something I'm not going to get too much into, but there's probably smaller homes that were surrounding this as well, like smaller, more rustic cabins. But this may have been where a supervisor of some type or a manager of the place would have been. Little holes are, of course, where we excavated. And we have not excavated everything out. This is our screening station, our back dirt piles of where we dug. And again, this was in the middle of farm fields. So when you go driving around and you see all those farm fields, there's things in there, yeah. Lots of cool stuff. So to even get even closer now, to zoom in, there's our archaeologist. Remember that kind of orangey spot? This is it. So you can kind of see the outline of bricks here. There's a lot of like dirt and ash. Again, you can see how deep it was, because after they abandoned this structure around 1840, it was built around 1800, abandoned in 1840, which goes right along with the time Thompson was there, because he died around 1836. So this here, you can see there was, well, you can't see this, but there were tons of artifacts in here. Animal bones, there was like turtle shells, there were crab claws, there was muskrat, because if you don't know anything about Cambridge, that area loves their muskrat, historically and today. I think there's even a festival. There's a lot of pork, which pork was probably the one of the most popular type of animal that you'd feed enslaved people. A lot of the rations they gave them were invisible, so you'd have the offal, like the intestines from the animals that they would be given to the enslaved people. Also, bacon fat. So again, archaeological, we don't capture this, but we do have oral information and history that tells us that's what they ate. But they also, like I said, supplemented with maritime foods, fish, oysters, those sorts of things. So we found a lot of these sorts of artifacts. But as we began to dig through here and get deeper and deeper, this is a bird's eye view. This is where I just had you looking. We got kind of in the cellar area, and this is Sammy here digging, and she like found this kind of like conglomeration of like artifacts kind of jumbled up there. And I shared this with you before if you were at the talk in 2023, but this was interesting because I was on Ben Ross's site when they were digging this site, and they said, we got this really cool artifact, and it was this interesting like glass-shaped like bottle stopper that was a heart-shaped glass bottle stopper. And I'm like, where'd you guys find that? And like, oh yeah, we found it like in the cellar. There's nothing else around. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right. I'll be right there. So I got in the UTV and sped through the Phragmites, got to the end, and I said, hear me, let's keep digging around it, see if there's anything else there. So we started digging, and sure enough, like in a little cache of artifacts, this was that glass heart-shaped bottle stopper, and then you had bits of ceramic, and there's a color blue in there. You can't see it that well, but there's a big Cheeto here. So we ended up x-raying it. It was like a kind of a heavy iron spike with another nail attached to it. And over here, there's going to be your copper alloy, like a waistcoat or coat button. So very popular in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So this was together. There was nothing else around it. And that was, completely it. So let's see. So the question is like, what is this thing, right? So I'm not the only archaeologist to have found one of these things. We think that they're associated with West African spirit practices or the Bakongo religion. And it's interesting because this sort of religion, this culture survived the transatlantic slave trade. And no one really talks about it. It's not really documented, but it's in the archaeology. And that's why, it's so important that I had to go find out what else were the other archaeologists finding, and was what we were finding unique, because this was found in a cellar in front of the fireplace. So that was curious. And I'm wondering, like, why was it placed there? What's going on here? So this came from Annapolis, under some floorboards in a place where enslaved people lived. And if you look closely, you're going to have the weird kind of asterisk thing in this cup. You have like these crystals. You have the round buttons. You have the straight pins. And you have I think part of like a bone of some type. So they've interpreted these West spirit practices as they can be protective. They can be empowered with energy and magic. And so they're finding these things, and they're in Annapolis. They're also in Montgomery County. And this one I found in right where the ICC has cut through. So this was found about, remember I just had my baby, so that was like 16 years ago. So it was a long time ago. We found it, and it was a stone foundation, but underneath in the layers of the stone fireplace, there were these kind of caches of artifacts. And and there's a lot of people that are suspicious. Archaeologists, they like to argue with each other and kind of scoff and criticize, and they're like, this is nothing. The rats brought that stuff in, and this couldn't be anything, and this is, everything's always ritual with you people. So but it is. And oops, let me go back a little bit. Oh, hang on. Okay, so what you're looking at here, again, more buttons, this glass, which again has reflective properties, this red brick, metal fasteners, roundness, beads, and mica here, probably from, sometimes those old stoves have those mica fronts to them. I think this is some sort of weird blue stone, some, again, metal mesh, beads. What else am I missing? Pipe stem. So, and I want you to think about this, is that what you're looking at and what's important is what it's made out of and the color. It's not the object itself. So think round, think reflective, think red, blue, and think about the iron. And we'll get to that in a sec. Because now what we're going to do is we're going to go to Africa. So we've all kind of come to the conclusion that these sorts of caches, these collections, are surviving the transatlantic slave trade, and they're coming from West Central Africa, which is where a lot of the enslaved people were taken from. Specifically, if this is related to the Bakongo religion, it's coming out of the Congo, which would be, here's the Congo here, and Angola right here. This is where the Bakongo religion kind of began, but it kind of spread out all throughout here. And what we're kind of noticing is that, from a lot of different research historians and others, is that once people who were enslaved were kidnapped and taken from Africa and brought here, at least half of them did believe in this religion, knew about it, and knew the power of it. If you talk to local African Americans in Dorchester County now, they know about it. A lot of them are Christians, so they're like, stay away from it. It's root work, it's hoodoo, we stay away. But this was a sort of a creolization of the Bakongo religion into folklore, folk magic that made itself here and that we're finding archaeologically. So if we want to dig a little bit deeper, what are the roots of this, right? So the Bakongo religion, a lot of it's centered around the hiding or the creating of Nkisi, also known as Nikisi, which is singular. And what these are is that they are objects or containers of medicine and spirits. So just to kind of walk you around this interesting looking guy here, he's carved out of wood, came from the 19th century, from the Republic of Congo. And you'll see that he's got this weird kind of center here. That would have received the medicine or the object. So it could have been roots, it could have been bone. It could have been any sort of artifacts or objects would have gone in here. That would have been the medicine, the spirit would have gone in there. And you would have plugged it up maybe with some shell or a mirror or glass of some type. So this one here, it's been taken out. But this would have, probably they did it to deactivate it. So this would have had the cover here. And you can see these eyes are reflective, probably shell. And then you see all these nails in it, almost like a voodoo doll, right? So, and you also see like bits of iron that have been driven into it. Well, this thing was used probably over and over again. And, can you guys hear me okay? I'm just gonna like put this thing down. Yeah, because it's not behaving. So, so they would take this and drive the nails and these metal pieces into this object to activate it. Again, it's just kind of like the voodoo dolls. So, so they would activate it that way, and it would have spirit medicine, and it would have the ancestors. So the goal of these things were to go ahead and communicate with the ancestors who could then influence the world that you're living in today. Here you have these jars that began to be manufactured in South Carolina in the 19th century. If you're enslaved, if you have a religion that is totally anti-Christian, and you want to still like, resist and do your own religion, you're going to do it so it looks like something functional, right? So this thing looks exactly like this guy over here. You can see the eyes, you can see even the mouth that's open. And it has an opening to receive the medicine, the objects. And this is actually found here from an archaeological site. So I believe that these jars, these face jugs, were probably being used for the same purpose. They were Minkisi. But down here, you'll see a bundle. So if you want to even be more obscure and hide this even more, you can create a bundle out of a cloth. You can put all sorts of things, again, the bone, the glass, the red, the color red, straight pins, round things, all these sorts of objects could go in here, and you can bury them. They can be buried in cellars, they can be buried in holes, they can be put underneath floors. And that's sometimes what Mark Leone from the University of Maryland has found in his work in Annapolis, is that these bundles or these things have been even just put under floors to help protect them. So the function to protect people and communities, also to inflict harm or protect against enemies. So if we found, like, ours is interesting because it's at the entrance of a fireplace, which I'll get to in a second. But that's something important. Now, what are they made out of? Wood, iron, mirror, teeth, bone, fiber, and porcelain. The colors include white, blue, red, and yellow. Like I mentioned, it's the material and the color. Again, they're coming here, they don't have everything at their disposal, so they're kind of making do. And in time, that kind of evolves a little bit to be creolized or to become kind of Americanized. They did the same thing with their cooking. They would have that, you hear about Creole cooking all the time, and about, it's coming from Africa with all the spices and the way they cook things. It's the same type of thing. Then they're just kind of making do with what they have available to them, but still able to keep their culture. So ours, so let's go ahead and kind of unpack what we found. So the iron nails, which are right here, I believe the nails, they're also often driven into the Nikisi to activate it and from the action. They can also be associated with the deity Ogun, who is all about strength and power and represented with iron. So that's important for that. The copper alloy button, it goes unclothed, but it doesn't have anything to do with the person who wore it or the function of the button. It's the roundness that's important. And it may represent the Bakongo cosmogram. So this is the roundness. We talked about buttons, and if you have like the four worlds, think about a four-hole button. These things, like, they transition very easily into trying to like create that and to communicate that to your ancestors. So you can see that there's a physical world, a spirit world, and this is the kind of the way they see their world. And life is they don't see there really being there's a separation, but there's still the spirit world is very active in the living in the natural world. So those sorts of things play out on a daily basis, and that's why these Minkisi can be activated. I mean, you have that power. There's a potential there, and you can help your ancestors help protect you. The plate sherds and shell, you can see there. White color and clay material. So again, you can do pipe stems, you can do actual clay itself. That'll direct the spirit. The glass bottle stopper, we talked about there being either crystals, sometimes they'll take projectile points, arrowheads that are made out of crystal and use those. Glass, anything that will reflect the spirit, and also communicate the water between the living and the dead. So again, this bundle contained medicine, spirit, and what does it mean for us? I think what we found is we found it, since it was placed at the fireplace, it's probably protection for those who live inside. Again, imagine being enslaved. You have no power. You could be sold off at any time. You're always threatened with not enough food. You always have the threat of control and violence against you. Your family being taken by the overseer. Again, this is a very, again, contested landscape where you don't have a lot of control. So they're doing everything in their power to help. Right. These Ninkisi, the bundles, the spirit bundles, will be staying in the building, because when it's there and it's buried there, it protects the people within the home and protects the home. So, and it's also usually placed in the chimney area or across a doorway or under a window, because that's where spirits enter. And I sometimes also, and I don't even mean to be disrespectful, but like, where does Saint Nick come from? Santa Claus. He comes through that chimney. So again, that's where spirits enter. So it's not. I mean, the Germans, and they have their own folklore, right? So it's not that far off. So it's the other thing. Again, I think the most important thing is that, again, this was a protective cache, and this did survive this transatlantic slave trade through the 19th century. But again, if you're looking at oral histories, the stuff is still out there, and grandparents are being known to also have dabbled in it. Okay, so any other questions about Bakongo religion, Minkisis, or any sort of anything about these spirit caches before we move on to the next topic? Nothing? You guys good? All right, how much time I gotta move along. All right, so we're gonna do plates. So the one question I always get is what are these people doing with teacups and beautiful plates in a slave quarter? What is it doing there? And if you've ever been to a plantation site and you've gone to a slave quarter, it's a rustic cabin, there's a bed in the ground, there's gourd dippers, there's little benches to sit on, there's a couple redware bowls and some pottery, but there's nothing decorative or fancy, right? Which, I get it, that communicates a rustic, enslaved, impoverished, living in existence, which is the correct message. But I think it's also limiting, because these people did have access to all sorts of tea wares and things. In fact, from Mount Vernon, a visitor from 1797 came through and was introduced to a slave cabin there. And what they said is, we entered one of the huts of the blacks. The husband and wife sleep on a mean pallet, the children on the ground, a very bad fireplace, some utensils for cooking. But in the middle of this poverty, some cups and a teapot. So these people did, even though it wasn't the formal Victorian tea service, and it wasn't a way to entertain and impress your lady friends as they came over, these things were functional. So as archaeologists, we can't look at this as people using teacups and a teapot as the way their European enslaver did. Instead, we need to see it as how people of African descent may have used it. Perhaps the cups were scoops for some African, creolized stew. Perhaps it was to hold us hot sauce. Perhaps it was to drink some sort of herbal tea, or that had some sort of medicinal value. So although they probably drank tea, and I think that, I'm sure they did, they also used these cups for other things because they had that flexibility within their home space to do so. Yes. Yes, good, excellent question. So that's the thing, is we always think, how do they get these wares? Because a lot of times they're always unmatched. There's no nice sets of dishware. It's always a random cup, and there's not enough saucers, and where is everything? So yes, they received furniture, they received clothing, they received cups and saucers and dishes as hand-me-downs from the enslaver. That absolutely happened. But they also had the ability and the agency to go out and purchase their own. So that's kind of, it segues into the next thing. So you're correct, they did receive some things, but not everything was given to them by their enslaver. So they had enough to make enough money. Harriet Tubman often rented herself out. Tobacco during that time period wasn't a thing as much anymore, so you had people who had some off time, and it was expensive to keep enslaved people, and that's kind of, again, one of the reasons you started to get away from enslavement, particularly in Maryland, because tobacco just wasn't valuable. They realized, in fact, Francis Scott Key began to realize that, keeping enslaved people probably wasn't the best idea in the world, and that now we have all these, black people around us, what do we do? So Francis Scott Key, not to throw shade in the guy, but Francis Scott Key was a big founder of the African Colonization Society, who wanted to go ahead and take African Americans back to Africa. So the Back to Africa movement to Liberia, to ship them all back there. And of course, that was a complete failure. But where was I? Kind of distracted, and I started thinking about the bridge. Okay, so 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 anyway, and how we're probably not going to name it Francis Scott Key Bridge again. But so anyway, they were given some things, but they also had enough money and ability to go out and buy things themselves. And so they would take on extra washing. They would go to the store and they get teacups and teapots. But the big question we have is when you had a choice to go to the store and pick things out, these are the types of things we see. We see these sorts of sherds in all of our archaeological sites. These transfer prints, which if you're like me, we probably have a couple old 19th century ones sitting in our little buffet or on our table or shelf. So, you have these two guys here on the left who are sitting, who knows talking about what. You have a teacup, some pastoral romantic scene. And then you have what we call dipped wares down the bottom, which have these interesting rouletting around the outside. We've got decorative designs, and the colors are a certain color. Again, people of, these are all being shipped from England. So if you were of African descent and just came over and you remember your culture, what would you have chosen? This is a textile from Sierra Leone from the 19th century. So people were coming here, and if your culture had these patterns, these colors, what are you going to gravitate towards in the local country store? So things that you have to think about. And as archaeologists, we need to get to work beginning to count our sherds. How many sherds of this stuff, these dipped wares, do we have in our collection versus transfer prints? And the transfer prints were more expensive than these, but still, what is that saying? Again, a lot of more questions and answers here, but things we're starting to look at and think about. This is from the Belvoir Quarter in Crownsville. These are some ceramics that we pulled right from the place that actually Francis Scott Key's great-grandparents built it, and he hung out there some too. Francis Key's all over the place today. Okay, so here we are. So this came from a place where his family enslaved these people. This is the type of wares they had. This here is a piece of fabric collected from a British port in the late 18th century. Again, it's very, very similar. So what are you putting? And these are made in England. Then I think to myself, who's the potter? Are they from Africa? So, and then I'm Googling and I can't find anything yet. So you almost have to go into the archives and begin to really get to the root of this. Who are the potters, and are these designs coming from Africa? And I haven't been able to find that yet, but it's a question. But the interesting thing too, and again, I'm running out of time, but the interesting thing too on the left is that these campaigners are abolitionists. They'd go to these ships that would just come from Africa. So this guy was stepping in from England. He'd come to the ship and he'd gather up bits of their culture, like the fabrics, the artwork, things that they may have brought with them. And he'd take them, he'd go to Parliament and say, these are people, because back then, they saw people of African descent as, close to animals, as people who weren't, savages, right? And so, but they would take them, these abolitionists would take this to sit there and try to humanize these people. They're human, they have culture, they have art, this is the food they make, as just to try and show that these people need to have their freedom. So it was an interesting thing that kind of came out of all this, and something that I didn't know. But this is from, the ones on top are from Ben Ross's site. So Ben Ross was also rocking the dipped ware. And then the bottom part too, you can see that's a worm design, but the ones on the bottom are what they look like in their complete form. And as archaeologists, we see find the things on top. Yes. No, that's the thing, is that this stuff is from England. Yeah. So the pottery, and all the pottery you see, everything that they're using is coming from England. The textiles are coming from Africa. And they're copying the textiles. They could be gravitating towards those ceramics based on the textiles and the designs and the fabric colors. So when the slaves are taken from Africa, they're coming with textiles. Yes, they may come with them textiles and it may be taken off of them. The enslavers as well that go over and capture them might be kind of taking things with them as well to give to these campaigners. So again, they're going to their ships and they're taking all sorts of stuff with them. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So I think that's what's going on, is these campaigners are I'm going to give you some shillings and you go over there, and when you're over there, gather me this, and bring it home. And then they're probably cutting a deal on the side at the port. So that's my story anyway. That sounds logical. So anyway, so we'll keep on going, because again, I'm running out of time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. We're going to go into oral histories now, and this I'll just need 5 minutes, so I might take a lot of my time, next six minutes. But here we have the Brodus farm again. That's where she went when she was a little girl. Malone's church, we're going to get to an Outback. We're going to get to, but remember the quarter site? That's where that West African spirit cache was found, and Ben's tent. So you guys know these places. So now we're going to go west, and we're going to go ahead and meet the neighbors and the family and the location where Harriet Tubman ended up meeting her husband John Tubman, his family, and it was known as Outback. And so in this kind of process, we began to meet a lot of people and realize that Harriet Tubman is only one woman and only part of the story of resistance and self-emancipation and this sort of world. We kind of have this kind of like tunnel vision on Harriet Tubman, and I want us to cast our net a little bit wider and look at the landscape that she lived in and the people that made up that landscape. And so what we're going to do is we're looking at Malone's church because they have a community there. And I also am looking at Outback, which has nothing there now, but there used to be communities and homes that used to stand there on the landscape. This is Malone's church. Before there's Malone's church in 1864, which is in November 1st, 1864 was Emancipation Day. In 1864, that's when they were able to, the enslaved people of Harrisville and Madison were able to build themselves a church and a school. So they began to educate and worship in this location. That building eventually, I think, fell down several years ago, but they still had their burying ground, their cemetery, and in the 1890s, they put up a new church. So that's Malone's church. It's not active now. The building is there, and they're actively trying to save it. The people that are trying to save it and that are part of this community are, we call them the Harrisville and Madison community, who are also associated with the Malone's church and cemetery maintenance fund. So we found these people in our study of Harriet Tubman. These are all descended from the people that live next to Harriet Tubman. These are their ancestors. One of the guys who I'll show you in a second is Uncle Joe, and he actually has stories about Harriet Tubman. And this is the importance of oral histories and the way that we take historical documents, we take archaeology and artifacts, and we take oral histories, and we use these to really tell our story. Because if we just rely on one resource, we're going to miss a lot, and we might not be able to like kind of confirm it. So that's why it's so important, especially as historical archaeologists, to look at all of our different data sources, including people living today, because they have memories, they have, and they're also important to involve for not only reason that this is their family history. They have certain questions that they want to have answered that I may not have thought of. So the types of, this is a runaway ad, and the interesting thing is these are the types of things we're finding in the archives that directly speak to Nancy Ennals, who is one of our oral history people we're doing an oral history with, Renee McKinney. That's her relative. So these people, and I'm like, I find these, I'm like texting Renee, I'm like, look at this one, and she's like, oh my gosh, yeah, that's my family. And so together we're kind of in this discovery of her family together, and so it's really kind of creating this great project. This on the left is Renee, in the middle is Uncle Joe, and on the right is Pop Joe. Pop Joe is Uncle Joe's father, and that's her grandfather. And I mean, this guy, wow. I mean, just the way he looks, the things that he's seen and experienced. I believe his grandparents were enslaved, and we're working with them to look at their housing. There's one house out there still. There's a lot of different relatives out there that we're interviewing. And again, oral history is so important. You can see that just some examples of the types of questions I'm beginning to ask them. Who enslaved your great-great-grandparents? What was it like? What are the stories? And they have stories about people who are enslaved there. But the thing is that it's hurtful. They don't want to tell them. And even when I go talk to people who are in their 60s and 70s, I'm like, what did your grandparents tell you? They didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about the racism because it was hurtful, and they wanted to shield them or to protect them. And while there was resistance and civil rights going on, a lot of the population just wanted to live in peace, and they wanted to protect their children. So you kind of see this kind of double thing happening. But the good news is that these stories are getting out. We're right literally in the middle of still collecting oral histories with these women. Renee McKinney is on the left. There's Betty Camper. Campers are a big name in Cambridge. And then we have Candace Giles, who's on the left, have pictures of their ancestors and their relatives. And so we're recording and we're videoing, and then we're transcribing all those, so they'll be saved and then put in the Maryland State Archives for the future. And then just to let you know, in May, we'll be doing a survey. So let me orientate you. So over to the right here, this is where, this is Harrisville Road. Remember I told you down here, that's where Ben Ross lived, and the quarters up here. So to the east over here, that's where we were. And now we're going to the west. Tobacco Stick is also called Madison today. But this road right here is White Marsh Road, and it ends in, this is all swampy now. Out here is a complete swamp. And but here is where we're going to be digging in this general direction. It's all on private property. National Park Service owns some other property. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service owns some property. But all this is gone. There's nothing out here. There's no homes. This is 1877. There's no homes there today. You can see this is where the Malone's church is, and that's about it. So it's all a big archaeological site right now. This is what it looks like. Wish us luck. There's lots of ticks out there. But you can see they had to throw this road in there because it's all underwater now. Here are some yuccas. So you can tell where these buildings used to be. There's yucca, there's the old daffodils. So those are the things, if you're looking for house sites, those are always the markers. All right, so one more slide. So this is my commercial at the end. So what we have here is we have Ben's 10. If you haven't gone to that Maryland Public Television documentary, that goes all over Ben's 10 and enslavement on the Eastern Shore. It was put out during Black History Month in February. So if you just Google Ben's 10, Maryland Public Television, you can watch this. It's an hour-long documentary online, really well done. And the Maryland Roadside Historical Marker, I want to make a plug for that. That program is closed right now, but be looking forward in January. We're going to be reopening it. We just want to get rid of the backlog so that people aren't disappointed. And then we have 2 Facebook pages, Maryland Archaeology and the Harriet Tubman Archaeology Laboratory. You can learn more about our work on those 2 sites as well. We also have Instagram too, so you can get to it probably from the Harriet Tubman Archaeology Laboratory. So that's it. 101. Thank you. Yeah, so the whole premise of the whole demolition, but the question is like demolition by neglect. Like just to explain it, if you have an historic home and you refuse to take care of it, you let the roof fall in, the vultures start to nest, and things that it just kind of begins to melt back into the earth and fall apart. That's called demolition by neglect. That's usually underneath Section 106, and if it's either any sort of federal land or federal anything, an excess usually. The state law, the Maryland Historical Trust Act, if it's on state land. If this is private, I don't know if you're going to have any help with that. So in May, what we'll be doing is we're looking for basically anything. Obviously, the yucca and the daffodils kind of show us where we're going to be, but we're going to be walking along the White Marsh Road and excavating in there on private property. We have permission, and just looking for the presence and absence of some of those buildings. So we're going to be looking for the buildings, trying to find where they're at. And the goal is to kind of resurrect where these homes were, because the people that we're doing our oral histories with, those are their ancestors' homes. So we're trying to connect all those. Again, oral history, archaeology, historical documents. So we'll see what we find. Yes, so the human remains detection dogs are something we do use on a pretty regular basis to find cemeteries. They're good at, I think a good example is back at Belvoir. We did an excavation. There was a little knoll, and these grown guys are in their 50s said, well, I know where the slave cemetery is. I'm like, yeah, right. And he's like, yeah, we do. I'm like, all right. So we went out there and we started looking. I'm like, oh, this does look good. And of course, they didn't have any headstones, but they had field markers. So those field stones were all over. And then they had a couple cedars. And I'm like, well, this does look pretty good. So a great use of those human remain detection dogs is to come up and give us a yay or nay, right? So we brought up Partner and Raven. And there's this woman named Heather Roche, and she calls herself Heather in the Herd, and she brings her dogs, and they do a survey. And what it does is it looks for a scent that human, not to get gross, but human remains emit, I think, 470 different unique chemicals. And that decomposition creates an odor, and sometimes it's trapped in the ground, and can also sometimes come into the trees. And the dog sometimes will alert up the trees. But I remember Partner coming and running on there. He was a puppy at the time. He's coming and he just went and stopped like that because he hit the scent. It's like there was a scent pool around it, or an island of the scent. and he hid it, and he went to work. And then once he found like a concentration, he'd sit down like that, and he'd look again. But yeah, I mean, so these dogs are real. I don't think they're good enough to give X marks a spot, but they'll give you at least a kind of a up or down if you have a cemetery, which is useful. Any other questions?
I would love to commend you on how you remembered the families of both sides, and who married and what. That was just amazing, and no notes.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hopefully, I got it right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Don't ask me her sister and brothers. Yeah, I mean, when you get into it, you really get into it, and you end up like seeing it and reading it kind of on a regular basis, that it kind of just becomes your own family in a way. So,
How do you get involved?
for me, I was born just wanting to do it when I was 7 years old, and my parents told me I'd never make any money doing it, and I never get a job, so that's why I stayed in it. So. We don't so much, but Anne Arundel County has a big volunteer program. They have the Lost Towns Project. So, so if you're interested in doing, hit Maryland Archaeology's Facebook page and look for opportunities there as well. They'll be popping up. Yeah. Yeah, I worked with Ken Short doing the Elk Ridge Furnace Inn. So we were digging out the Elk Ridge Furnace Inn, those two cabins that are down there. They had a question like, were those slave cabins? And the answer is yes. But the Ellicotts never enslaved anybody, I don't think. I think it was out, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it was but the cabins were probably built around 1840, and the Howards were the ones who likely enslaved and had those cabins put up for that time at the Elk Ridge Furnace Inn. So. Yeah, it's Archaeology Month. So, yeah, that's. Okay, sure. Yep. Any other questions? All right, thank you all for your patience and your time.